When asked the question of what is the most important issue for Congress to address in 2021, well, many issues come to mind. Racial justice, criminal justice reform, climate change, healthcare, and all of those are indeed issues that Congress needs to address. But there's one thing that all of them have in common. Congress needs to address them. And that means that Congress needs to be responsive to the American people. Our representative democracy needs to actually represent the interests of the people. And is that currently the case? Unfortunately, it's not. And that is why campaign finance reform is the most important issue for Congress to address in 2021.
2015, with a political campaign finance system that is corrupt and that is increasingly controlled by billionaires and special interests.
For the last 10 years, Congress's approval rating has hovered around 20%, with few exceptions. That is to say, even with congressional elections every 2 years, the people we elect within our democracy are overwhelmingly disliked, with only 20% or fewer taking their side. How can it be that in a democracy with only two parties, where it takes roughly 50% of the vote to win, that the approval rating still hovers at only 20%? These must be terribly unlikable people. Back in the 1800s, presidential election turnout was more than 80%. Now, it's usually less than 50%, and it's way lower in the midterm elections and much lower in the primaries. People don't like their options and don't want to vote. Now, I'm not here to shame people who don't vote. Our goal here is to understand why people don't vote in a country that prides itself on being a democracy, and why our democratic institutions like Congress are so universally disliked. And the answer is a little shocking. It's because we're not a democracy. A Princeton University study in 2014 came to the shocking conclusion that America is not a democracy and hasn't been one for decades. They looked at public policy questions between 1981 and 2002. In other words, they studied every question that came before Congress in those 2 decades and looked at how Congress voted. They then compared Congress's vote with the opinions of the average American citizen, the economic elites, and interest groups. They found that public policy in those 2 decades correlated quite well with the interests of the moneyed elites and the interests of strong lobbying groups. But there was near zero correlation between public policy and public opinion. If 60% of the American people were in favor of a policy, a huge majority, it had the same likelihood of passing Congress as something with only 20% popular approval. But if you were a billionaire, that policy would be twice as likely to pass. You and I basically had no say in whether or not Congress would approve or strike down a policy. But the rich and lobbyists did. In other words, we aren't a democracy. We're an oligarchy. Our politicians tell us that universal health care is too expensive. We just can't afford it. Yet last year, the Pentagon spent over $1 trillion on the F-35 fighter jet that cannot lift off the ground. It is a plane that can't fly. A large problem is that our representatives have to spend so much of their time dialing dollar for donations. Here's my conversation with Wolfpack Director Michael Monedez. He touches on that subject.
So we have federal elected representatives right now, every single day of the year, going across the street into essentially phone booths, phone call centers, calling people with a lot of money, and they're not calling me, they're not calling you, Oliver, I would imagine.
Yeah.
They're calling a very, very tiny percentage of the population who can actually afford to fund their campaigns. And they're doing it out of necessity. That's the system that we've set up.
So how did our democracy get stolen like this? Well, mostly a famous Supreme Court decision you've probably heard called Citizens United. Without getting into a whole lot of the details, Citizens United allowed corporations to spend whatever they wanted on ads supporting or attacking any candidate during any time in the election. The First Amendment apparently protects the rights of interest groups and corporations to rig the election. Let me pull out my pocket constitution and take a look at the First Amendment. Because I don't see anywhere in this document where it says that corporations have the freedom to spend unlimited amounts of money on a campaign in order to get their interests represented. That is corruption, plain and simple. For those who love protecting the First Amendment at all costs, if money is truly free speech, then a whole bunch of laws exist on the books that are unconstitutional. Hiring a hitman is 100% legal. I'm only using my speech to tell the hitman, I really wish this person were dead. I'm not responsible for the hitman killing the person. Just like the billionaire donor is not responsible if a politician, after receiving millions from them, votes in favor of the donor's interests. Do you see how ridiculous this is? We shot democracy in the head, and money is speech was the hitman. Our democracy died. The Constitution is in tatters. The very thing our founding fathers were proud of, a democracy of, by, and for the people, perished. It is now an oligarchy of, by, and for the rich. Congress is full of millionaires who get campaign contributions from billionaires and corporations to pass legislation that benefits billionaires and corporations, regardless of what the people want. And as I mentioned, we're supposed to be a representative democracy. Representative means we are governed by people like you and me, not millionaires. It means more average citizens have to run for office. It's possible to win and beat the big incumbents with more fundraising. It's just a huge hurdle to cross. We need to take back our democracy. And that would actually make America great again.